Welcome back to the Dynasty Circle podcast. I'm delighted to share this conversation with Gyula Klima, one of the leading scholars in medieval philosophy, especially metaphysics, logic, and the philosophy of language. In this interview, we discuss a central medieval issue, the problem of universals. It's really a cluster of questions, but for Klima, the questions kind of center on the puzzle of universal cognition. So the puzzle's basically, how can the mind possess universal knowledge, such as, knowing that every right triangle, for every right triangle, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So the question is, how can the mind possess such universal knowledge when it only ever encounters singular, particular things? So I began the conversation by asking Klima about his background and how he first came to philosophy.
Well, I was born in Hungary, Budapest, still behind the Iron Curtain, right into the middle of the Hungarian Revolution, which is why I was born at home and not in a hospital, because a Soviet tank just destroyed the hospital where my mom would have been taken with me to to give birth to me. Well, in any case, so it was in a nice suburban area in the outskirts of Budapest called Gyula Star Hill, and I was raised there. Went to school in the area. Went to high school as well in Budapest. Got all my degrees in Hungary. How on earth did I get into philosophy? As far as I can tell, I've always had philosophical questions. So when since I can remember, I had philosophical questions, although at the time I didn't know they were philosophical. And so, but I always wanted to understand everything, but everything is too much. So I figured that perhaps the most sensible and practical focus of my universalistic interest would be focusing on the human mind, because everything is filtered through the mind. And how do we get to know about anything? And perhaps through that, everything. And so I started thinking about the mechanisms, the workings of the mind. And at the time, of course, I naively identified the mind with the brain, which drove me toward biology, chemistry, neurophysiology. So I majored in chemistry in high school and in biology and chemistry in my early university studies. But as I got into the nitty gritty of natural science, I realized that most of my questions were conceptual rather than empirical, which is why after the first year, I swapped out chemistry for philosophy. And after the third year, I swapped out biology for aesthetics. So I ended up with diplomas in philosophy and aesthetics.
Great. So today, we're going to be kind of discussing issues that come up in your article, The Medieval Problem of Universals from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So maybe we could just start off like, what would be a really rough, simple characterization of the problem of universals?
So the first motivation is an epistemic question. How is it possible that I know all potential infinity of singular things that belong to the same kind, that I recognize as belonging to the same kind? So obviously, this kind of universal question, or this kind of universal knowledge, cannot be attained by going over
One by one.
one by one all the singulars that fall under the subject of such a universal claim, because they are potentially infinite. And we
Right.
always have a finite lifetime, and even human history is a finite, etc. So the finitude of our physical being is confronted with the potential infinity of universal knowledge. So How is that possible?
Right. So if like we consider like an example, like the Pythagorean theorem, that's a case where we know about a potential infinite number of right triangles that, a squared plus b squared equals
C squared.
c squared, the hypotenuse squared, right? And and in there, it's like, yeah, it's not as though we could go one by one through every right triangle and discover, oh, look, it's again and again the hypotenuse
And
squared is equal
we
to
would
the
have to measure, right, and take
right.
measurements, etc. And in fact, that would be a very imprecise method, because whenever we draw an empirical physical triangle, right, a visible one, then it is obviously going to fall short of what we have in mind. A triangle being
Straight lines.
being a geometrical shape constituted by three straight lines, which are supposed to be one-dimensional, without a width.
Mm.
But have you ever seen uh, a line without width? Of course not. So, but the theorem, strictly speaking, applies only to that sort of a triangle, right? Which
Right. Yeah. In your article, it's pretty funny. So you talk about Thales' theorem in your article, and obviously that pertains to a circle, and then a semicircle in a circle, and then inscribing a triangle in the semicircle. And it's funny where you go, well, let's zoom in on the circle that we drew, and if you zoom in, it's actually just a series of jagged edges. It's not.
exactly, it's not at all like what we are supposed to have in mind. So, where does that kind of object come into our consciousness? That was Plato's first
Right.
question. When we are talking about circle, uh, geometrically perfect circle, or a sphere, a geometrically perfect sphere, right? We have an understanding of the object as uh, being a shape on a plane, or a shape in space in 3D. Uh, uh, all of the points of which are equidistant from a given point, namely the center, right? But how can these be precisely equidistant from a given point? Let's say let's just take the circle. If the circle would have these several points giving width to the perimeter of the circle, or the circumference of the circle, right? The circumference also would have to be an unextended line, so that every point on that line can be precisely equidistant from the
Mm.
given point, the center of the circle, right? And so
Right.
we cannot possibly see such an object, right?
Right. So not only can we not review every last, let's say, right triangle to reach the Pythagorean theorem, even a particular given visible right triangle.
It's not exactly what this demonstration is about.
Right. Perfect. Yeah. And so good. So yeah, and we'll get a little bit more into this line of thought in a second. But just to review real quick, it's like, yeah, like you said, the medieval problem of universals, the way you look at it is a bundle of kind of related epistemological, metaphysical, logical problems. But they all kind of center around this issue of how is it possible that we have universal cognition, universal knowledge such as, yeah, for every right triangle, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, or every triangle, the interior angles add up to 180 or something like that. So anyway, so that's kind of the way you characterize it. And maybe before we go further into motivating the problem of universals, because basically, the way you kind of describe it is, look, this problem of universals, it's not a historical curiosity. It just kind of arises naturally when you think about, for example, a geometric demonstration. Before we get into that, could you kind of just really quickly map some of the positions that developed around the problem of universals. We don't need tons of detail, but just kind of a sense for the listeners of the basic options and the thinkers associated with those options.
Yeah. So it all started with Plato, pretty much motivated by the line of thought that we started out with. That is, apparently, we can have universal knowledge based on having this awareness of these ideal objects that we cannot really find in our empirical environment. And yet, somehow, we have this awareness of these ideal objects. The empirical objects are just at best approximations to these ideal objects. But for instance, our geometrical demonstrations obviously are not about these empirical objects, but about the ideal objects that we have in mind. And what we have in mind, however, is just more or less approximated by the empirical objects in our sensible environment. So, what is the relationship between this ideal object and this sensible physical object, the singulars, which somehow imitate and share in the features of that ideal object that we have in mind? So, Plato's idea was that there must be a different realm of reality. In fact, a more perfect realm of reality in which these ideal objects exist. And that is what he called the forms or the ideas that are the exemplars, the exemplary causes of whatever we can find in our environment, more or less approaching that ideal object. So the several pearls, billiard balls, I wouldn't say footballs because American footballs. So all sorts of balls are approximating the ideal sphere, right? So yet the what when we are talking about geometrical objects, those are the things that we have these universal demonstrations about, right? And so when we are um, making the demonstration of the Euclidean theorem about the internal angles of any triangle, then we have in mind this universal triangle that is the exemplar of all visible triangles we can ever draw or we can ever construct, as say the side of a pyramid, etc., which are obviously not those ideal objects, but somehow partake in the features of the ideal objects, and that is why geometry is applicable to physical things as well. So Plato's original idea was that there must be this different realm of ideal objects that we somehow must have gotten in contact with, maybe in a different form of existence, in this disembodied form of existence that is our souls before entering the body, um, uh, getting in contact with these ideal objects, got this awareness. So that would be naive Platonic realism.
So it's like we have a geometric proof, let's say, of whatever it is, Thales' theorem or the Pythagorean theorem, and maybe as we remember in our geometry class in middle school and stuff, you generally would you'd have a figure drawn out, whether it's on the paper or in the sand or something, you'd have a figure drawn out, which you would be like kind of reasoning with or through to reach the particular geometric conclusion. And I think that the Platonic idea is like, well, that particular figure that you drew in the sand, it's not, in a sense, it's not genuinely a triangle because, for example, the lines aren't all straight. They have width, like you said earlier. And so what was really that geometric proof about? It was actually about an ideal object, something that we kind of saw with our didn't
It is what we have in mind. It's what we intellectually understand, and the drawn figure is just something a help, a reminder, and aiding, keeping track of your thought during or in the course of the demonstration. Right. So now I'm talking about this side, that side, that side, and the parallel running through the base, extended, etc., etc. So when I'm but obviously, the demonstration is not about that figure, and especially not that particular figure, because that figure just stands in for the universal object, which is the exemplar of all possible uh, triangles that can ever be drawn, right?
And what allows us to have this knowledge of, so for example, with the Pythagorean theorem, what allows us to know something about a potentially infinite number of right triangles, what allows us to know, I guess, a fact about each of these potentially infinite number of right triangles is our knowledge of that ideal form, that ideal object. So we know this ideal triangle, which is kind of in, as it were, some Platonic heaven.
Hmm.
And in virtue of knowing that, we then can know something about all the objects that imitate it. And so, yeah, like, and we'll go into this more, but, that's the Platonic position. We'll talk about in a moment, kind of Boethius's arguments against this sort of Platonic realism. But maybe at this point, could you just, yeah, briefly just talk a little bit about, what's another realist position that.
Well, another obviously other positions are motivated by the flaws in the original naive Platonic theory that Plato himself already recognized in his Parmenides. He was the first to come up with an argument that became famous as the third man argument. Um, uh, that was presented by Aristotle in that form. Plato's argument deals with the idea of greatness. It doesn't really matter what particular example we are taking, but it draws out an inconsistency from Plato's naive theory of forms. So there had to be some alternative solution to the original problem. That if Plato's theory is inconsistent, then what else can we say about the original problem of the possibility of universal knowledge? And so Aristotle came up with an alternative solution, which is the, let's say, the grandfather of all conceptualist solutions. That is, universals are not uh, sort of different ideal realm of entities, but rather the universals are universally representing concepts of our minds. And I will motivate this with a further argument pointing out exactly what kind of inconsistency Plato's theory contains and how Aristotle's theory of abstraction, we are going to go and get into that too, avoids that sort of inconsistency, but raises a number of further problems. That is, okay, we have these abstract concepts in our minds. What are these concepts? How are they related to the singulars again? So we have another ontological problem stemming from the epistemic question, right? And then it is that ontological problem about these universal objects of our minds. So, what are they then? If they are not existing in a separate realm in the Platonic heaven of ideas, then what are these ghastly non entities that we are still always aware of? Okay, and how do we get into uh, them and how we can apply them to, again, visible, concrete, physical objects. Now, that led to a number of further refinements of the original, somewhat sketchy Aristotelian idea and became very much at the paradigmatic sort of conceptualism up to the 13th century, let's say, late 13th, early 14th century, which conceived of universals as universal representations of singulars in the mind. But that led to a number of further issues in metaphysics, very complicated, very hair-splitting distinctions, culminating in the theory of formal distinction in John Duns Scotus, which was the direct motivation for William Ockham to try to start with a clean slate. Okay, so this is way too complicated. And as he would say, it is all just stemming from bad logic. And because these people don't understand how the natural logic of the human mind is working. And so he came up with much, much reduced ontology in the first place, which he can at the same time present as the adequate picture of reality onto which all our concepts can be mapped. So basically, I could characterize his program as see how much logic and semantics I can do with what with how few and how little an ontology. Okay, so that is pretty much the nominalist program that is coming up with a much reduced ontology and explaining everything, all those conceptual mechanisms that are needed in explaining the workings of our minds within the realm of concepts, but also the realm of concepts themselves. The concepts themselves were reinterpreted by Occam. That is what these concepts are and how they are related to the objects they represent would radically redraw the map, as it were, of the Aristotelian semantic triangle, that is the relationship between words, concepts, and things. That is how words become meaningful on account of being related to our concepts, whereby we conceive of things. Now, how this semantic triangle is worked out in detail as radically different already in this nominalist conception, which had again incredibly important and far-reaching epistemic consequences. So, motivated by epistemology, we get into semantics and ontology. And when the ontology becomes too complicated in medieval via antiqua, that is pre-Occamist conceptualism, then, then we have the motivation for a much reduced ontology in Occam, redefining the semantic triangle, which then will have further far-reaching consequences in epistemology, because it is Occamist nominalism, that is my claim at any rate, that opens up first in history the conceptual possibility of demon skepticism, which we know as such from Descartes. So modernity, modern philosophy started not really with Descartes, but already with Occam. that, that is
fascinating. Yeah.
no
Your
wonder,
article.
by the way, that the nominalist school came to be called the Via Moderna, as opposed to the earlier school of thought, the Via Antiqua.
Got a sense now of the three options here of the kind of Platonic realist position, you might say, and then the sort of conceptualist position that you might associate with
Aristotle all the way to Duns Scotus, yes. And even further, so the story did not end with Scotus, but then there was the altercation between the VA, pretty much like
Right.
the altercation between continental and analytic philosophy and American philosophy department until very lately, very recently.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Let's talk a little about Boethius. So, my understanding is that he gave a really influential interpretation of Plato and universals. And
But perhaps before getting into that, and perhaps before getting into detail of Boethius' argument, I would not want to skip an important previous figure, namely Augustine, and his concept of divine ideas. That is, because that is going to be as it were, the resting place of Platonic ideas, namely the divine mind, the ideas of the divine mind from Augustine onward throughout the medieval period. And why is it important that they are in the divine mind so that they have this sort of mental existence? Because that is how Plato's um, naive theory can be overcome, as it were. The inconsistency of Plato's naive theory can be overcome by Aristotelian abstractionism. So think of a triangle in the Euclidean demonstration about the three internal angles of a triangle. You have just any triangle whatsoever. You extend the base and covering two vertices, and you draw a parallel across the third vertex, and that you can actually read off the and diagram the conclusion that the internal angles should equal two right angles, that is 180 degrees. Fine. What is that demonstration about? No matter what kind of triangle you can draw or even conceive of, it would have to be such that either at least one pair of its sides, that is, at least two sides of it are equal, or no sides of it are equal. In the former case, it's an isosceles, and in the latter case, it's a scalene triangle. Right now, I'm lumping equilateral triangles together with isosceles triangles. So all triangles, given that it is a triangle, that it has three sides, and of the three sides, at least one pair of sides is equal, or no sides are equal. A triangle as such has to have this disjunctive property that it is either isosceles or scalene. You cannot think of a triangle that is not such that it is either isosceles or scalene. However, the Platonic form of all triangles cannot be isosceles, because then it would be the exemplar only of isosceles triangles, right? And it cannot be a scalene triangle, because then it would be the exemplar only of scalene triangles. But it is a triangle, so it has to be either isosceles or scalene. But it cannot be isosceles, and it cannot be scalene. It's a contradiction, right? This idea of this universal entity, this universal triangle, would have to be an inconsistent object, much like a round square. So it cannot exist. Nothing can be a universal triangle that is either isosceles or scalene, and neither isosceles nor scalene.
if there's going to be this ideal perfect triangle, well, it has to be a triangle. But every triangle, either no sides are equal, or at least two sides are equal.
That's right.
And so it looks like this ideal triangle will either have to be isosceles, at least two sides equal, or scalene, no sides equal. But if it's scalene, like you said, then it won't be the model
Of all triangles.
of all triangles. It'll only be the model of scale. And if it's isosceles, then it won't be the model of the scale. So it looks like it needs to be both scalene and isosceles, which is impossible. So, like you said, it's an inconsistent object. It's a
Mhm. So it cannot be. That is what I take to be definitive refutation of naive Platonism. That is uh, conceiving of these universal objects as existing entities, existing in their universality, that would have to have all these disjunctive properties and cannot have any of the disjuncts of these disjunctive properties. And you can run this argument through just any sort of object. So if you are talking about humans, the idea of humans, the form of humans, um, being a human would have to have some height, right? But all humans are either, let's say, less than or equal to or greater or taller than, say, 5 feet, right? But then it would also have to be either shorter than, equal to, or taller than 5 feet. But it cannot be either because or none of these. It cannot be any of these because it is. It cannot be less than 5 feet. It can be equal 5 feet. It cannot be taller than 5 feet. And so again, just any of these disjunctive properties that would have to belong to any physical entity of any kind, right? Would have to belong to the form itself if it is of the same kind, right?
mm-hmm.
And yet, none of the disjuncts could be a feature of the ideal entity. So it cannot exist as such. That is the problem there. On the other hand, what the hell are we talking about, and what are we thinking about when we are doing the Euclidean demonstration about the internal angles of a triangle? What we have in mind is triangle as such, and we think of it as it would have to be either isosceles or scalene, but we are not thinking of it as isosceles, and we are not thinking of it as scalene.
Right.
And there is no inconsistency in that. So we are abstracting from its peculiarities that would belong to this or that kind of triangle, right? We are just thinking of it in terms of our concept of triangles as such, and understand that that concept implies that it would have to be either isosceles or scalene, but we are not considering the implication, either of the disjuncts of this disjunctive implication. So we separate in mind, in thought, that cannot be separated in reality, because any real triangle that you draw would have to be either isosceles or scalene triangle. But you can think of either of these without thinking that it is isosceles and without thinking that it's scalene.
Yeah, and this is kind of like, I don't know, like the magic of the human mind here is that, like you said, we are able to conceive of a triangle separated from it being scalene or it being isosceles,
Exactly.
even though in reality no triangle could pass on both scalene and isosceles. No, it has to opt for one or the other. Either none of its sides are equal, or at least two of them are equal.
What you see on the diagram drawn for illustrating the demonstration,
Mm,
it is either an isosceles triangle or a scalene triangle, but you're not looking at it as isosceles or as scalene, we are looking at it as a triangle, no matter
Right.
which kind it is. The point of thinking the demonstration through only in terms of the concept of a triangle and not in terms of the concept of the isosceles triangle or in terms of the concept of a scalene triangle. Even if you can only draw one or the other kind of triangle,
Right.
you can think of either kind only in terms of the concept of a triangle without thinking of it as isosceles and without thinking of it as scalene. Right? That is abstraction.
Good. Okay. So yeah, obviously we're now getting into this kind of Aristotelian territory.
Yes, and this is precisely the idea, even if Augustine never really goes into, but it was already present in a Neoplatonic thought by his time, that in the mind we can separate things that cannot be separated in reality, and that is how God can have these universal exemplars for his creation in his mind without any inconsistency involved about these alleged universal entities that Plato started out with.
Yeah. So just regarding the divine ideas tradition, I mean, it's sort of on the face of it, it's a little bit tricky to understand because, like, on the one hand, it seems like, oh, okay, these medieval thinkers are heavily Aristotelian. They're going in for a more conceptualist framework, potentially, and yet you also have the divine ideas tradition, which looks like a more Platonic strand. Do you have anything to say about that? Like, just helping us understand how those are consistent, how it's not
Mhm. So
intention.
if we can agree on that simple claim that universals as objects of the mind are not inconsistent in the way Plato's original universal entities were inconsistent objects, right? Then placing universals in the mind avoids this original inconsistency in Plato's naive theory. And apparently, it doesn't matter much, at least from the point of view of this problem alone, whether we are considering a human mind or a
Or
divine mind.
gods. Yeah.
Yes. But as you will see, if we can go on with this later, that will be also somewhat problematic concerning divine knowledge, divine cognition, divine omniscience, whether these are really sort of abstract objects. Obviously, they are not resulting from abstraction, but insofar as they are objects of a mind, they are not inconsistent in the way Plato's real exemplars would have to be. Okay, now, but obviously, divine ideas are not the same kind of ideas as our universal concepts. Um, God is omniscient creator of all reality, and he has knowledge, therefore, about everything, even before he brought them into existence by his act of creation. What is that knowledge like? How can he know about these different kinds of objects that he is about to create from eternity, right? And just a very sketchy hint of the idea is that God, in his omniscience, is considering himself as the worthiest object of cognition, obviously, and in all possible ways in which this object can be considered. In fact, he can also conceive of himself in all the possible ways in which his perfection can be shared by limited perfections, creatures of limited natures that can only share in some of the features of this intensive infinity of divine perfection. And it is these conceptions of these finite natures, uh, sharing in divine perfection in their finite moods, which are the creative ideas of God, serving as the exemplars
Right.
of creation.
And so you're also hinting there at, Aquinas's solution to a sort of problem that comes up with the divine ideas framework, or an apparent problem, which is that, how could there be this plurality of ideas in the divine mind when God is simple, utterly one, without parts? And so part of the solution, or the solution perhaps to that in Aquinas as well, really what God is understanding is he's understanding all the ways, as you describe, as you said, all the ways in which he can be imitated by finite entities, and so that theory also kind of connects to this other kind of
Yeah,
major philosophical
yeah,
issue.
because the solution is simply that the all different ways of conceiving of an object would not multiply the object of thought itself, right? So you can think of Donald Trump as the president. You can think of Donald Trump as the husband of Melania. You are thinking of one and the same object of thought in different ways under different concepts. So the multiplication of the concepts or ideas does not multiply the object itself. Hence, the plurality of divine ideas does not contradict the simplicity of the divine essence itself.
Beautiful. What do you think about turning to? We've discussed like this problem of the Platonic universal being inconsistent. So with respect to the triangle, it seems like it's going to have to be both scalene and isosceles, which is impossible. What do you think about maybe looking at Boethius's
Yes.
specific argument? And maybe I'll just try to like throw it out really quick. It has something to do with his thought is like, each particular entity, which is supposed to be participating in this Platonic universal, each particular entity has a distinct act of being. But if the Platonic universal is sort of constituting the substance of each, it seems like we're going to be led into a situation where instead of many distinct acts of being, we just collapse it down into one, and we lose that distinction of acts of being among the numerous particulars. So anyway, can you kind of just talk a little bit
Yeah,
about that whole
you,
argument?
you very neatly laid out the argument, actually. And this is precisely the reason why uh, Duns Scotus later on in the late 13th century would have to uh, talk about universals as having less than numerical unity. That is, there is one universal, let's say one universal humanity in all of us humans, making us individual human beings. But we cannot say that that unity of human nature amounts to the same unity, same kind of unity as you have, or I have, or any other individual human has. So it is a sort of solution of a paradox by type theory. It's pretty much like I'm putting it in modern terms. That is distinguishing entities of different types with different kinds of conditions for individuation and therefore unity or disunity, right?
That's fascinating. I didn't realize. Okay, so it's like, Scotus as a realist,
He wants to have real universals working in the causal architecture of this empirical reality. So he would not place those his universals in a Platonic heaven of ideas, or he is not talking about divine ideas. His really existing universals would somehow run across all the singulars of the same kind, and it is the universal that constitutes their kind. And in fact, it is through the universal that the causality of individuals is subject to universal laws, because they all act indifferently insofar as they are instances of the same kind. Okay, so this is just an anticipation of the complications that is coming out from this sort of realistic position of universals, which Boethius is trying to avoid. He would say that, if we posit real universals, which constitute simultaneously the essences of all the individuals, then the individuals could not independently come into being and cease to be, because they would essentially have to have the same act of being, the same existence.
and it's a little bit similar, right? You also review in your article. This is coming many years later, but Abelard kind of reminds me of an argument he makes where he seems to be saying something like, yeah, if there's going to be this universal outside the mind, which constitutes the substance of numerous particulars, well, then we're actually going to have one existence, one being, but then this one being ends up having inconsistent properties. It's both tall in virtue of Shaq, and then short in virtue of my son. And so then you get a inconsistent being in that way. And so that argument seems somewhat similar.
Yes, and in fact, it is getting repeated time and again in other authors as well, and also Abelard with his theory of the status, right, of the things. He's also just trying to pull off a balancing act between pure conceptualism and some sort of moderate realism, um, uh, talking about the status of being human, or the status of being this or that kind, which he would not identify with any particular entity, but he would also not say that it is just pure concept of the mind. So it is again trying to avoid inconsistency by introducing something like type theory, that is distinguishing entities of different kinds, right? Of different types, so different ontological types, not just different species of the same kind. Right?
Yeah, I mean, do you want to maybe briefly talk about Abelard's theory of status now, or because yeah, it might be interesting to discuss that approach. Although we'd also, it would be nice also to talk a little bit about Boethius's solution. I mean,
Well, the general solution is pretty much the same for all of them. That is, things, the features of things, of individuals, are separable in thought without being separable in reality. So that is pretty much the idea of abstraction. The original,
and so the universal ends up, it's not existing in reality as one thing shared by many.
yes,
Instead, it's going to be, the universal is going to be existing in the intellect as like a kind of active understanding. It's like there's a type of understanding which sort of has a universal
okay.
grouping function.
Yes. So, and this is where things are becoming more complicated, because And this is what leads us to that rather complicated semantic diagram that you can find in the eighth section of the Universals article, which summarizes pretty much the Via Antiqua conception, especially as it is articulated by Aquinas.
Yeah, and like you said, it can get complicated. It's like we're going from sense data to the common sense to the cogitative power to the phantasm to the active intellect to the intelligible species.
We
It's
don't know exactly how Abelard would conceive of the details of getting to these status of things, and he definitely is going for a conceptualist position, even if sometimes he's characterized as a nominalist. But this wobbliness of the terminology, I'm afraid, that is basically all thinkers after Aristotle can be characterized as conceptualists. That is epistemically universals are universal concepts, and universally existing um, uh, Platonic entities were pretty much abandoned by everybody through the course of history. Even if John of Salisbury in his Metalogicon still credits some people with positing such real universals, but and they were not, let's say, the dominating thinkers, especially in later medieval philosophy. So after the 12th century, after the recovery of much of Aristotle's work, original work, because before that, all they could work with were Boethius and Boethius's translations of Aristotle's logical works, the categories and the perihermeneias, and also his translation and commentaries on the Porphyrian isagoge, the introduction to Aristotle's categories. But as Aristotle's metaphysics got recovered, that provided more ammunition to the trend of Aristotelianism, which eventually yielded this general commitment to regarding universals as primarily objects of thought. Okay, the universals anterior, that is the universals before the things would be the divine ideas, that is objects of divine thought. Universals in rebus would be the individualized instances of these universal archetypes in the divine mind, and the universals post-rem would be the human concepts drawn from these instances of the universals, conceived in their universality by the human mind. So, this truly abstractive and abstracted universal existence is due to the abstractive activity of the intellect. And this is what provides universality to the objects of our singular cognitive acts. So that is a further issue.
and I want to be sensitive to the time here, but maybe we could just briefly touch on a kind of interesting problem that Boethius deals with, which is okay. So if the universal is going to be in the mind, if it's going to be a sort of universal act of understanding, it's going to be a universal act of understanding external things which are themselves particular.
Mhm.
And so you seem to have this kind of mismatch where the act of understanding is universal, but what it understands is particular. And so he considers this objection that, well, normally when you have a mismatch between understanding and the object of understanding, that's falsehood. So what does this mean? Does it mean that all of our, universal concepts are false? And
Again, the idea of what is separable in thought uh, uh, does not have to be separable in reality, or what cannot be separated in reality can still be separated.
you bring up the example of the mode of being of a representation can be different than the object of representation, but that doesn't mean it's false.
But there's this argument, which recurs time and again in Boethius and Abelard and John of Salisbury, that an intellect thinking the thing to be otherwise than it is false. But the intellect is thinking of things universally, and they do not exist universally. So the universal thinking intellect must be false, right? The universal thinking intellect, thinking of singulars, must be false, right? Because it's thinking of things to be otherwise than they are. But then, but when we are thinking of singulars in terms of universal concepts, we are not thinking them to be this way or that way or that way, but we are just thinking of them universally, in a universal fashion, but we are not thinking them to be universally.
Right. Because, I mean, if I think of a triangle, a specific triangle as a triangle, just because I'm not including in my mind, the fact that it's a scalene triangle or the fact that it's an isosceles triangle, that doesn't immediately mean I'm wrong to think of it as a triangle simply because I lay aside a particular feature of it. Obviously, if in my mind there's like a mismatch in the sense of me attributing to the triangle scaling, the character of scaling when it's not scaling, obviously that type of mismatch where you attribute to the triangle a way of being which it doesn't have as scaling versus not scaling, that type of mismatch is falsehood.
Yes.
And that's a judgment.
That is the simple idea. So, Boethius, especially in Latin, makes this distinction very neatly, distinguishing between two possible readings of the scope of the adverb aliter, that is otherwise. So, an understanding, thinking of a thing otherwise than it is false. This can be understood in two ways. Otherwise, covering the object, the thing, the intellect understanding the thing otherwise, to be otherwise than the thing is, would be false, right? But the thing, if the adverb, the otherwise, governs the act of the intellect, or modifies the act of the intellect. So the intellect thinking the thing in a way that is different from the way in which the thing is, that doesn't have to be false.
Would be sensitive to time here, and there's a lot in your article, of course, which we weren't able to touch on. I don't know, just to kind of wrap up, would you want to maybe tell us a little bit about what you're working on these days, what you're currently working on?
What is perhaps most directly related to the subject of our conversation is the Aquinas' argument for the immateriality of the intellect from the universality of its objects. That is, Aquinas is arguing that any material cognitive power that we have, any sensitive power that we have, and any material representation that we can produce in these material cognitive powers, such as sight, hearing, etc., must be representing singularly. in a singular fashion. We cannot see universals, we cannot hear universals, etc., but we can think universals. And if it is true that this implication holds, that as long as a representation, cognitive representation is material, it must be singular, then by modus tollens, if cognitive representation is non-singular, then it must be non-material, right? And the intellect's representations are non-singular. Therefore, the intellect must be immaterial. Now, that is the gist of the argument. And of course, the implication needs to be justified that material cognitive representations must always be singular. Okay, this is something that I've been discussing several times already in the past couple of years. It started way back in even in the late 90s, early 2000s. In any case, so I'm trying to simplify the argument itself, and besides just simplifying, I'm also trying to universalize it, generalize it, so that we can apply its conclusions to artificial intelligence. And so the question is whether even these large language models that seem to be behaving and responding so intelligently, etc., do they really have intelligence in the way we have? Can they really have intelligence in the way we do? If they cannot have this awareness of universals that we have in our intellectual representations, having our intellectual concepts. Because these machines are necessarily material constructs. But then, what do they do? Do they have any idea of what they are doing? Or are they just like the guy in the Chinese room? Okay, so these are pretty much the things that I'm currently involved in, besides just writing a big monograph. I'm actually wrapping up a big monograph called After Form, Recovering the Lost Scholastic Aristotelian Idea of Form for Contemporary Use, which, in which I summarize most of the stuff that I've been involved in the past couple of decades.
Oh wow, well that's fantastic, and so I definitely recommend to listeners. Obviously, this stands for an encyclopedia article on the problem of universals, but also your work kind of engaging with.
It is easily available on academia.edu.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Gyula, again for coming on and sharing your insights into this fascinating topic. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you again. I enjoyed the conversation.